Good evening. There is a dark curse at sunset. Most of us are immune. Most of us gaze upon the bright colors and feel only a sense of joy, or at worst, a bittersweet longing. But there are those out there who, when they see a sunset, feel an empty hole at the bottom of their hearts, an infinitely deep and infinitely dark hole, black as coal, that hole. A veritable Mel's hole. Who are these poor accursed individuals? The UFO grifters, the UFO scammers, and the UFO clowns who have nothing better to do than to churn up lies that they plagiarized from others more imaginative than themselves in order to gain money and fame. Yes, you know who you are, you UFO scoundrels. And as hard as you try to UFO push it away, I know you feel that UFO curse. You feel it every UFO evening in the darkly smoldering light of Ufo Sunset. Birds have some really badass ways of dealing with hurricanes, and as it turns out, it doesn't involve living in retirement communities in Palm Beach. Plus, who knows what dark unidentified objects lurked in the skies over Operation Moonwatch? Jeff's shadow knows. And signals and noise without end. Trained pilots report strange craft, but if they're reporting UFOs, how do they even know what they're reporting? All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Jeff Knox.
I'm Luis Cayetano.
Welcome to Ufo Sunset. And now for the rebrief. ESA plans to launch a satellite only to destroy it in the sky. The European Space Agency announced on Tuesday that they plan to launch a satellite into space in 2027 to see what sorts of things happen when it burns up in the atmosphere. The mission is called Destructive Re-Entry Assessment Container Object, or DRACO for short. 3 million euros were awarded to the company Deimos to begin the project. This space safety mission is part of ESA's plan to prevent the creation of any new space debris by 2030, what the organization dubs a zero-debris approach. Space debris is made up of all of the bits and pieces created by satellites and spacecraft, which orbit the Earth and wreak havoc by colliding at high velocities with other satellites and spacecraft. The ESA press release states, quote, "Satellites can be built for controlled re-entries, or with extra effort, some may go through assisted re-entries or targeted re-entries. Yet it is more efficient to meet space debris mitigation guidelines by being designed for demise from the start and disintegrate entirely during re-entry," unquote. According to DRACO project manager Stein Lemons, using experiments in the lab is too limited, and while virtual modeling is effective, it requires more data in order for these simulations to be properly calibrated. In 2013, ESA used a mounted camera to monitor the re-entry of an automatic transfer vehicle, or ATV, used to ship cargo to the International Space Station. The DRACO satellite, which is compared to the size of a washing machine, will carry 4 additional cameras, as well as sensors for measuring temperature, strain on the hull, and outside pressure. What was captured on radar in the eye of Hurricane Helene? On Thursday, Colin McCarthy, a popular storm tracker and freshman at UC Davis, posted a radar image to Twitter displaying Hurricane Helene with a large quote-unquote blue blob inside of it. The image was produced using the My Radar weather app and was taken as the storm was passing over Florida. The blob appears to sit southeast of Tallahassee. Hurricane Helene traveled 600 miles inland through Florida to Tennessee. The devastation it caused includes record flooding, and at least 60 deaths, according to the New York Times today. McCarthy's tweet reads, quote, "See this blue blob on radar? These are birds stuck in the eye of Hurricane Helene." The tweet amassed 1.4 million views as of me writing this, with many in the comments expressing skepticism that these are birds. But, as we've reported in the past, birds do wind up in the eyes of storms, such as a shearwater that was tracked entering the eye of a typhoon near Tokyo in 2019, or a swallow-tailed kite that was tracked inside of Hurricane Debby this summer. Some birds, such as the Desertos petrel, will even follow storms at sea to make use of their favorable winds and to hunt prey churned up in the water. Helene also triggered a mass migration of some 500 million birds, who traveled west of the storm to capitalize on its fast-moving winds. On Friday, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reported that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology used a bird migration map called Birdcast to track the mass migration. According to a story by Aaron Jones at NBC News affiliate News 9 in Denver, though it hasn't been verified that the blob is definitely composed of birds, it is in fact common for birds as well as other animals to appear on radar. In previous stories, we've reported on flocks of birds responding to fireworks in the Netherlands, studied using radar, and flocks of bats that were tracked on radar in Arizona during June. Even insects are commonly studied using radar. In a story from Vox, Matthew Vanderbroek, professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at University of Lincoln, Nebraska, explained that large flocks of birds and swarms of insects have been reported inside of storms for centuries. Vanderbroek also conducted a study of 33 Atlantic hurricanes that occurred in the 2010s, all of which showed signs of birds or insects inside. There is an invasion of ladybirds underway in Alberta. On Saturday, City News Calgary in Alberta, Canada, reported that an invasion of ladybugs is threatening native Canadian species. Dr. Tanya Mousseau, a lecturer at Mount Royal University in Calgary, told City News that the seven-spotted lady beetle was introduced from Europe in the 1970s to control aphids and other garden pests. Since then, the seven-spotted lady beetle has become a problem in eastern Canada. Mousseau said that now this problem is spreading to Alberta. This ladybug, along with other imported beetle species, like the Asian lady beetle, are outcompeting and sometimes feeding on native species of ladybugs. But the spread of these beetles is helped because they're sold in greenhouse and plant stores. There are many native species of ladybugs in Canada, and invasive species threaten Canadian insect biodiversity. The transverse lady beetle, which is listed as under special concern by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, is threatened by competition and as prey by the Asian lady beetle. City News quoted Mousseau as saying, quote, "I don't know how this can be stopped. I mean, in eastern Canada, it's really bad. They're just taking shovelfuls full, but in Alberta, it hasn't been that bad until this year." City News recommends buying ladybugs from garden centers that get their supplies from the National Insect Control, which sells species native to North America, such as the convergent ladybug. And now for Ufos Chat. Oh, actually, okay, so I think it's Jeff's turn to speak. So now for Jeff Knox with more on Operation Moonwatch and UFOs.
Right. So, today we're just going to quickly go through a few of the Moonwatch cases that I wanted to talk about last time. But went a little long and didn't have time to finish adding them. The first case we're going to talk about today is a case that happened, I guess, sort of locally here in Portland, Oregon, involving the Moonwatch team in Portland, Oregon. As you can see in this case, they're actually looking at the moon. This is a correct image view of the moon. I just noticed I have this moon guide on my wall back here that shows the same thing. And so that basically gives you the reference points of the various craters and, seas and whatnot, so you could see where the object was coming down through their field of view. So in this case, they weren't doing their normal duties, watching for, satellites or whatnot. They were just actually looking at the moon, and they see these objects kind of crossing across the lunar disk. Occasionally, they recognize the transits as just a bird flying by. But in addition to birds, they see these small kind of tiny dark objects that behave differently than the birds that they typically see. And there was two observers, these two, their brothers, sent in these pictures, these observations of the moon, and you can see the location of like Copernicus there, and a couple of the seas they mark on there. And then there was another observer that actually didn't see in it. And all these objects ended up passing in the exact same direction in the same location for about 1 second. And so they would move through the field of view real quick, and these multiple objects would do that quickly at the exact same place, same duration and time. Now, like I mentioned, there was another observer that did see this. Robert Beardwell was actually the team leader for the Oregon's Moonwatch team here in Portland. And he sent in a sketch to the supervisor that they would send in these reports to of what they saw. Now, the sketch between the two boys that were sent in and this kind of team leader, I guess, is kind of inverse in the opposite direction. But Carol Bordwell, the team leader's wife, mentions that the boys were actually unsure of the actual orientation of their telescope, and so that the direction that they sketched the objects might actually be back inverse of what theirs was, and that might explain why there was the opposite direction of the drawings. And the team leader, supervisor, Alex Geddes, who was not actually present at the time, sends a supportive letter back to the observers, thanking them for the data and for sending in this report. He kind of further states it's part of his job actually to look out for these UOs. If you remember in the presentation, they didn't call these unknown objects UFOs. They were just UOs. And he says, although this watch on UOs is part of my job, the regular Moonwatch work takes up practically all of my normal working hours, and the UOs have to be left for evenings and weekends. But don't think I'm grumbling. I enjoy every minute of it. I just don't want you to think that I just sit back and shake hands with the UO observations as they come in. While you have good people and others go to so much trouble to turn them in. So he sends in a supportive letter saying, hey, thanks for sending these in. I am looking at them. I unfortunately don't have a lot of time to look at them, but I do look at them when I get the chance. And that people, should continue to send these things in there. Now, with a lot of these sightings, that's really kind of these Moonwatch related sightings. That's kind of really all we got, is because we have an observation through a telescope. So we get some sort of a drawing, a scope drawing of what they see through their telescope and the path the object goes through. There isn't really like a whole lot of narrative like you get with a lot of more sensational UFO sightings or encounters. But in a way, we actually get more scientific data than we do with, a normal UFO encounter, because we have precise, measurements of where they're looking in the sky. We have precise timing measurements. And so from a standpoint of actual useful scientific data, we get more from these, but there really isn't just a whole lot to talk about them, because, you don't just, there's no story to go along with it. Like, oh, we saw it flying around and there was windows and we saw something through the windows. And it's usually just a very quick observation that they saw through the scope. So our second story here, got a lot of actually press coverage and was a fairly big story about a mystery satellite. And it involves the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, Illinois. And this happened on August 26th, 1960. And the staff at 9 p.m., Dr. Robert I. Johnson and other staff at the Adler Planetarium observe a faint reddish object in the sky that's sort of moving from east to west. And this story would be circulated in newspapers, all over the United States. And here it was covered in the Chicago Tribune. It's official, a new thing circling in the sky. The Salt Lake Tribune says, gazers report object reverses Earth's orbit. So this thing was moving in a retrograde orbit. And, it was, again, multiple newspaper articles here. Strange objects sighted in the sky by astronomers. Astronomers cite strange objects in the sky. Object sightings still pour in. Moonwatchers see strange objects in the sky. And so this case was heavily published in the newspaper, but they really sort of believed it was a mystery satellite and that it related to another event that happened the night before. So apparently the night before, on August 25th, the same mystery satellite was seen and photographed by some Grumman tracking observers in New York. So more specifically, on this case, this is the photo that they were able to take. And they assumed it was the same object because this object, this mystery satellite, as they called it, was moving in that east to west direction in this retrograde orbit. And the way, I guess, the timing would have worked out, Chicago would have seen it at about the time they did the following day. And so there's the assumption that it's the same object that the Grumman people photoed here. And so on October 25th, the day before in 1960, this dark satellite is seen and photographed 5 separate times by the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethridge, Long Island, New York. This satellite is supposed to be going very fast. It's supposed to be 3 times faster than Echo 1 satellite, and it's traveling in that east to west retrograde orbit rather than the typical west to east orbit. The inclination, they say, is about 135 degrees. And the color of the object is described as being carrot to straw in color. The Grumman observers estimate the object is in an eccentric orbit with an apogee that's as high as 4,200 miles and a perigee of about 300 miles. So that's quite a bit higher, if you recall, what like the initial Sputniks were at, and even what our like Explorer 1 and whatnot was at. Grumman actually ended up producing a proposal to the Air Force in order to share data in hopes of plotting a firm orbit for this kind of mystery satellite. I don't, unfortunately, really know what they determined it to be, if anything, or the observations just kind of stopped. But it's a case that they've been tied together. That Grumman photo, but they believe was the same object that the planetarium observers saw that night. Now, in the actual Moonwatch logs, we don't have a whole lot for the Adler Planetarium stuff. The only thing that was in the Moonwatch Ufos file that I mentioned last time kind of was this log file that mentions 2 listings for Chicago at that time, mentioning this object they saw with the reddish tint moving about twice the apparent angular velocity of the Echo satellite that they had just previously seen. So they knew it wasn't Echo because they'd just seen Echo, and it was something entirely different than Echo. And this story did, of course, make its way to the UFO literature. Here we can see it was covered in APRO Bulletin in September 1960, called Adler Astronomer Sees a UAO. UAO was the term that APRO preferred to use at the time instead of UFO, and it stands, of course, for Unidentified Aerial Object. And again, we see an article here from NICAP Special Bulletin from October 1960. Astronomer says mystery object may be spaceship. I think that might be a bit sensational of a title there. If by spaceship he means a satellite, then yes. And Robert Johnson, who ran the planetarium, in fact, got so many kind of inquiries about this from media and UFO researchers and people wanting to kind of like get his version of the events. He actually created this form letter And when I originally posted this case, I didn't have a copy of the original form letter. I just had a kind of a transcription that was included in a UFO publication. I actually found a copy of the real form letter that he would send out anytime anybody would ask him about this case, that would give them the basic details kind of what he saw. And I'll just read kind of a part of it to you here real quick. It says, since the advent of the space age, people have become increasingly interested in observing passages of artificial satellites. The planetarium staff has noted a rise in the number of unidentifiable objects in the sky reported to our institution during this period. This is due to the fact that more people are watching the sky, so objects and events that have gone unnoticed in the past are now being observed. Unfortunately, it is impossible for us to personally answer all inquiries concerning such objects. However, all reports, whether written or telephoned, are kept on file, and when more information on a reported object is desired, we contact the observer. And then he goes on to explain the base details of his sighting that he would repeat to everyone. On Friday, August 26th, at approximately 9 p.m. Central CDT time, our museum staff observed a faint reddish object in the sky moving from east to west. Apparently, this object, or similar ones, were almost simultaneously seen by both inexperienced and professional observers throughout the country. It is believed that the object we observed was photographed at a satellite tracking station on the East Coast. From these observations, it was found that an orbit could be calculated, but since the observations are inadequate, it cannot be said that the object is revolving about the Earth. The most we can say at present is due to the inadequate observations, the nature of the object remains unexplained. So that's about all we have on that one. They really had insufficient data to, I guess, calculate an orbit or to really determine what it was, or if it was even something that was truly orbiting the Earth at the time. But that case did get quite a bit of publicity in newspapers kind of all around the country. Our last case here today is one that actually involves Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée, back in 1961, he was working at this observatory, the Paris Observatory in Meudon, France here, as part of satellite tracking as part of Moonwatch. And while he's doing this satellite tracking as part of Moonwatch, he ends up observing a mystery satellite. And there's scant kind of details on this. The only kind of details besides from that listing from the article by Swords of the various Moonwatch cases was I found in his proposal that I talked about last time, where he had this list of roughly 36 sightings that could be further investigated. He lists one of them is his sighting he had on July 11th, 1961, that apparently he had at about 10:35 universal time, and saw it at an azimuth from where they were to at 153.2 degrees at an elevation of 28.19 degrees. And apparently he took another measurement, less than a minute later. So that's pretty much the only details we have for Vallée's kind of sighting there. What else we do know about his case is that the following day, apparently the project, the director of the project confiscates all their data and destroys it, apparently in fear of being laughed at by the press or scientific colleagues and the Americans. And we know this from Jacques Vallée's journals, his very first Forbidden Science volume. He has an entry where he talks about this. And I guess if it wasn't for Vallée keeping a copy of where he saw this thing and mentioning it in his book, we may not have known about the case. But he did have a sighting during one of these Operation Moonwatch things they were doing back in 1961, and it was included on that list of cases he had hoped to further study but didn't get the chance to because his proposal was, I don't know if he sent it in or it wasn't accepted or what. And that's that as far as those three kind of Moonwatch, three or four-ish Moonwatch cases. Like I say, a lot of these cases, in a sense, we have better data because we have precise data, because they needed precise data to track satellites. On the other hand, we don't, as far as like having a fun narrative to tell you guys. There really just isn't one in these cases. Like at best, in most of these cases, we just have a couple of those circular kind of drawings of what they see through the scope, and those few details like Jack Fillet list, and that's all we got. We don't know what it was. We don't know if it was a satellite. We don't know if it was a UFO, and because there's not really the movements that would make it seem to be something truly unusual, right? Like these things are moving across the field of view very quickly. And they're not like moving around and they're doing things. So whether you can call them UFOs, I guess that's why they call them unidentified objects, UOs, because who's to say they're flying?
Thank you, Jeff.
Yep.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about gender a little bit, like I promised last week. ITV, aka Viva Strange, made some interesting observations in the chat, previous Ufos chat, and why is it not letting me do this? There we go. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. It is true that there, as Luis also pointed out, that there is sexual dimorphism in the human brain. There are a few different studies here, for example, that talk about some of these differences. In this study from 2009, they talk about differences between the ratio of gray matter volume between cisgender men, cisgender women, and MTF transgender people. Here it's using the term transsexuals, which is still used today by many trans people, but anyway, it's kind of an iffy term when used by people that aren't trans, but it's not really too important. You'll notice if you look at some of these studies over a long period of time, studies compared to the 90s, you compare studies from the 90s to those from the 2000s to those from the 2010s and from this decade, that the language has shifted over time. In this one, again, we see evidence of sexual dimorphism, and this study, they suggest that there's evidence of psychosexual development being influenced by gonadal hormones, which corresponds to what Luis was observing. But on the other hand, they also made this observation in the discussion section of the paper. This is from 2020. In fact, it is important to note that the size of the brain sex differences is really small, and that life experiences could have a deep impact on brain development. So I think this point really underlines the importance, again, of using both quantitative data and qualitative data. So, relying on things like personal narratives and case studies. And then here's another one that talks about gray matter volume in trans women. And they find that, mind you, I have not read all of these studies really closely, and I'm not a medical expert. That what they find is that there may actually be a difference in brain structures from trans. So trans women actually have different brain structures from both cisgender men and cisgender women, and in most of these studies that I've included here, the differences are not limited to post-transition or post hormone replacement therapy, where the subject takes hormones. So in one of these studies, at least, they also, and actually I think in multiple studies they compare both population, they include populations that are both trans women who have started transitioning and trans women who are pre-transition. The study, what they call here in the study treatment naive. And it's important to note, I think, that, again, not being a medical or neurological expert here, there are limitations to these studies. They don't necessarily tell us what this means. Study of the brain is really limited in terms of, we can't look at what the networks are actually doing and what causes different things going on in the mind per se, because we have a very low level of resolution using the tools that we have, things like MRI and functional MRI, which are magnetic resonance imaging. We basically look at the brain in voxels. These are like three-dimensional pixels. They are three-dimensional pixels of the brain, but the area of a voxel has a lot of neurons inside of it. So it's very low resolution imaging. And then in this study, they from the 90s, they found a difference between the bed nucleus, what is it called? Hold on a second. Shoot, I can't remember what it's called, but it's a brain structure. It's a structure in the brain that is a part of the paralimbic system. So it deals with emotions, and it has to do with the fear response. And this is, again, sexually dimorphic between males and females. But I think another important thing to realize, especially with these gray matter studies, is that they are more, some of them are kind of limited. They only focus on a small number of people. But they also heavily rely on statistical differences. So much like there is a range of variation between male and female bodies. So, there are many female humans who, or I should say AFAB humans who have a range of variation in their bodies, and AMAB people have a range of variations in their bodies. And then, of course, we also have intersex conditions. And there's a trend among many medical professionals to depathologize intersex conditions. A major reason for this is because, because people don't want to be pathologized, and there's several different papers that I found really intriguing. Speaking as not an expert, basically presenting the arguments of experts here. Marianne Legato wrote this piece in 2018, Untangling the Gordian Knot of Human Sexuality. And basically what this outlines is how the medical evidence suggests that sexuality is not just either or, male or female, but it actually is, there's various different dimensions of sexuality. So you have the chromosomes, genes, hormones, and sexual characteristics and things like that. And each of those different aspects of sexuality has a range or continuum of expression. It's, you have different chromosomal conditions where a person may have other chromosome combinations other than XX or XY. They may have one X, or they may have multiple X's, and so forth. And there's a bunch of those, and a lot of those lead to intersex expression. And like, people have different hormonal expression, as we saw with the studies into neurobiology. there seems to be a range of expression in the brain, but that's also true just in the rest of the body as well. So, yeah, this is also an idea that's presented by Robert Sapolsky in this recent talk that he gave on YouTube in May. And he basically outlines very similar ideas to Marianne Legato, but he talks about a few other things. It's a pretty interesting talk because he also talks a lot about free will later on and his stance as a determinist, and how that impacts how that impacts like the educational system, how we should treat things like punishment and so forth. But yeah, he basically is saying that sex is non-dichotomous in the sense that it's a kind of continuum, basically. And he argues explicitly that intersex conditions should be depathologized, certain intersex conditions at least. So yeah. And one other thing that I wanted to talk about is that there are a number of studies that look at the negative societal impacts on trans people. This one is the one that I was talking about in the last Ufos Chat, which is by Alexis Dino, and it's from 2017. And what Alexis is trying to do here is estimate the number of homicides or the relative risks of homicides with respect to among trans people compared to cisgender comparators. And so now these estimates, basically she provides a bunch of different estimates by playing with different variables. And a major limitation of this study, which Alexis points out, is that we don't actually have full data on homicide rates. Homicide rates go unreported, or an individual may be misgendered, and because of that, even though the homicide is reported, it's not reported as a trans homicide. But what was found is that, again, trans feminine Black and Latina people are much more likely to experience homicide than their comparators in the general population. So what this means is that cisgender Black and Latina and BIPOC individuals are less likely to be the victims of homicide than their trans comparators. But again, this data is very limited. And there are a bunch of other studies that I am not including here that also look at violence and harassments. A really important one is the US Transgender Survey from 2015. This is a survey where they basically sent out questionnaires to many trans and non-binary people in America, and what it tends to show is that there's a lot of that trans and non-binary populations do experience higher rates of things like suicide, loss of job. This chart is, this is from an overview of the full study, and this is freely available online. Also, all of these references will be included on our blog. Higher rates of experience serious psychological distress. They also talk about higher rates of being targeted by the police, and so forth. of course, we can't just rely on survey questionnaires. We have to rely on other forms of data. And some of that data, like I said, like homicide rates, is fairly limited at this time. But there are other studies. I would point, for example, to some interesting Finnish studies on bullying in Finnish schools. And that suggested that trans people are targeted more often than cis people for bullying. I've seen similar studies in the US. There's one also that shows that non-binary people are targeted more than trans people who do not identify as non-binary. There is a 2022 US trans survey that has not been published yet, and there's just a few summary statistics from that. In this episode this is the first episode of Ufo Sunset, I talked about constructed identities, and I talked about this book, Neuroqueer Heresies. Another interesting aspect, psychological aspect of transgender, gender nonconformity, and gender variance is that there is an overlap between people who report gender dysphoria and who are diagnosed with autism or autism spectrum disorders. This doesn't mean that there's necessarily a causal factor there. It may be correlative. Nobody is entirely sure of the causes, but autistic quote unquote disorders, again, going back to pathologizing populations, there is the neurodiversity movement is a movement that is very much about depathologizing autism, because autistic populations are a natural part of all human populations. And this book kind of connects autism and neurodiversity. Nick Walker argues that the two are intrinsically connected, and I don't agree with that. But I do think that they are related, and they also have a lot of parallels. There is a stigmatization of both populations, and there's also an overlap between the two populations. Okay. That's pretty much it. So that's all I wanted to cover. I'm probably not going to come back to the topic of gender for a while, because I want to research more about special interest groups that promote anti-trans activism, like the Heritage Foundation, the LGB Alliance, and others. It's something I want to look at really in depth. There are definitely political motivations behind that, and so I think that there's really good reason to be very skeptical of very serious academic discourse that is critical of gender variance, not just because there's nothing pathologically wrong with being trans, in a similar way to there's nothing wrong with being pathologically, or there's nothing pathological about being gay, but because there are many indigenous gender identities in many different cultures over the world, all over the world, like I discussed 2 weeks ago, including hijras in South Asia and Pakistan, including identities across Polynesia, including identities in Thailand and Southeast Asia, including identities across the Americas, such as Two-Spirit, which is an umbrella term for many different Native American identities, and Muxe in Mexico, among others. I feel like I'm forgetting something, but that's mainly what I wanted to talk about. And again, this is not a topic that I'm going to be talking about for a while, because I want to do a lot more research. And, it's kind of stressful. It's emotionally stressful. All right, so let's talk about the reliability of UFO witness testimony.
Yep. So this is another chapter from the book. This is chapter 13, I think, or 12. Yeah, so this one's about the really famous Cash-Landrum incident. This is like the quintessential radiation or UFO radiation case, and supposedly these women and the son, the grandson to an extent, the Colby, suffered from ionizing radiation, and there was like vomiting or diarrhea, and some other symptoms like hair loss and skin rashes and so on. But it's really dubious as to whether these were caused by anything from that sighting that they had, whatever that was. So this article goes into all that. So here in the abstract, it mentions it happened in December 1980. Betty Cash, who was 51 at the time, her friend Vicky Landrum, who was 57, and Vicky's grandson Colby, who was 7. They saw a massive, or they say that they saw a massive hovering diamond-shaped object spewing kind of flames from the bottom, and that it was being escorted by 20 military helicopters, right? And so it's become a pretty notorious case, and people have debated it since then. It's often held up as a sort of very strong, case by advocates of UFO advocates and believers. But of course, skeptics have also had their own views about it. So this article is actually just a little bit tedious because it does go into some detail about like radiation sickness and symptoms and what level of radiation you need to exhibit certain effects. And so 40 years ago, Philip Klass, who's a famous skeptic, requested the author's assistant, so Gary Posner, his assistance in investigating the case. It was then 1-year-old case. So Posner was in his second year of medical practice as a general internist with limited knowledge regarding radiation-induced illness, and so he read up a lot on this topic, consulted various people, and so his efforts included textbook research, correspondence with, among others, the primary radiology consultant to MUFON, which is one of the main UFO organizations and was back then as well. And he's got a lot of these files and contents saved in that link there. So yeah, so and also he mentions here that the motif of physiological effects has made its way into the unidentified aerial phenomena law in the U.S. National Defense Act. So these sorts of stories and narratives have probably fed into that to, legislators feeling that they are justified in including that provision. So the eyewitnesses' testimony to the U.S. Air Force in 1981, Betty, Vicky, and Colby were interviewed jointly by 3 U.S. Air Force reps at Bergstrom Air Force Base in Texas. And so the following narrative is derived from a transcript of that. So Betty and Vicky believe the object to be not an alien spacecraft, interestingly, but an experimental U.S. government device. So that belief really fed into what they would subsequently do, which was to take legal action against the government, because they were convinced it was a military experiment or a craft. And so they saw the military as being responsible for the effects that they suffered. Now, Alan Hendry comes into play as well, so the famous UFO investigator who was respected by both skeptics and believers alike. So he recommended that Betty write to her Texas senators, and she did receive a response from Senator Lloyd Benston directing her to Bergstrom Air Force Base for assistance. I've just highlighted some stuff here for myself, but if we go to the next page, well, she talks a bit about like kind of the heat. It was really intense during the encounter, and that she kind of burned her hand and stuff like that. The object lifted off. Betty said that it was still too hot. We were all burning up, and within moments, there were helicopters completely around the object, right? And they were the two rotor type, so like a Chinook type helicopter, which, by the way, the Air Force didn't use at the time. I think they were used only by the Marines or the National Guard or the Army, but the Air Force apparently didn't use them at the time. So that's problematic, but the copters and UFO drifted away together, and the object emitted kind of a shrill beeping sound, which was apparently deafening. Betty estimated the duration to be about 15 to 17 minutes.
Just a bit different than the other two of them. Vicky said a few minutes that she felt she was outside, and Kobe was a little bit closer. He said 15 to 20 minutes. Yeah.
Right. So Betty insisted that she'd been feeling fine prior to the incident, but within 30 minutes of the experience, she began developing blisters on her head, face, back, and neck. She felt like it was burning from the inside out, and she reported prompt swelling of her lips and ears, hair loss, and at the time of the interview, nearly 8 months post-incident, continuing issues with stomach, upset stomach, diarrhea, fatigue, severe headaches, and other symptoms. Vicky recounted being outside the car for just a few minutes, most of the time apparently only partially, with an arm holding Colby in and the other arm up on the car, which she said she got burned from that. And she added that blisters on her arms continue to come and go on the back of her left hand. One questioner pointed out a bruise the size of a quarter, and kind of a deep purple, and there's actually a picture of that. But apparently that wasn't caused by the incident. That was just something that she had from exposure to the sun. And that actually appeared in a documentary or some document as being Betty's hand, right? But it was actually Vicky's. So she said that her hair started falling out about a month after the incident, but that has since regrown, but with a different texture. She said she initially was sick with diarrhea and everything, but most of her ongoing symptoms seemingly involved her eyes, which kind of formed like a film, sort of like with cataracts, but her eyes, she felt, were burned so badly during the incident that they teared for about 3 months. So she added that they still feel like they've got sand in them, and that maybe she would have to operate on her eyes. Colby concurred with a time frame of about 15 to 20 minutes. He said the object was kind of yellowish red, but was not asked and did not comment about its shape or having felt burning heat. Vicky described him as screaming and crying, yet when asked, when you saw it, what did you feel like? He replied, I just sat there wondering what it was and didn't feel nothing until I got up and the next morning with stomach pain and runny stool. The eyewitnesses' testimony to the media, so it became kind of a famous case in the media as well, and it was actually popularized in a 1998 Close Encounters episode of a series called The Unexplained, which is not unexplained or unsolved mysteries, but it was just called The Unexplained. It dealt with some paranormal and UFO stuff. But anyway, they were on that show. And on the program, Betty adds some flourishes to her Bergstrom Air Force Base rendition. So when she was talking to the staff at Bergstrom, this time she said some things which are a little bit different. So when attempting to re-enter the car, I just grabbed the door handle, and when I did, it just pulled all the meat off my hand. And that night I went to bed, and I was so sick all night, up chucking. The next morning I woke up and there was big blobs of hair on my pillow. Dr. Brian McClellan, a family practitioner who began treating Betty after her subsequent move to Alabama after the incident, offers the illness that she suffered 3 weeks after exposure was an absolute classic radiation injury in which she lost skin, hair on the exposed side. She then had diarrhea, vomiting, and the illnesses you get from ionizing radiation, and it was exactly on time, according to him. But we'll see that that's actually quite problematic. The story that he kind of pulls together cannot be true if it was actually ionizing radiation. So on the same show, Vicky explains that after the craft and helicopters flew away slowly toward Houston, about 13 kilometers into the resumption of their drive home, there was perhaps another whole bunch of the same kind of helicopters that were flying in with their searchlights on. They flew over us. So that was new, wasn't it, Jeff?
Yeah.
And that seems like a pretty important detail, actually. So that's sort of surprising. But this is fairly typical in a lot of UFO cases, which are, quite detailed or extravagant, is that you do get these narrative shifts or elements being added over time. So a photo of what the narrator misidentifies as the badly burned hand of Betty Cash was shown, but it was actually Vicky's hand. And that was not from radiation burns. It wasn't from ionizing radiation, but it was probably a sunspot. In 1985, HBO's America Undercover documentary series devoted a portion of its show, of its episode UFOs, What's Going On, to the Cash-Landrum case per Betty. After they found out really what had happened, then they started treating us as radioactive burns. And since then, I've had cancer. The narrator immediately clarifies that Betty's hospital records do not explicitly state that she was treated for radioactive burns, but that she exhibited symptoms similar to someone who might have been exposed to a radioactive element.
And that's not even the first. That's not even the first TV show that it was on. It was on ABC's That's Incredible a few years before that, in either 1981 or 1982. I'm not sure the exact date, but I know the hypnosis session was filmed in 1981 in July. That was used by the TV studio. This story was in the media pretty much immediately from, within the same year, within a year it was all over. So
I think they do mention the hypnosis later on, if I recall. That was in 1981. So dose-related effects of ionizing radiation. So Cash-Landrum's notoriety as a radiation case rests upon several reported medical effects allegedly caused by the witness's exposure: hair loss, acute skin burns with non-healing sores, gastrointestinal complaints like nausea and diarrhea. Within weeks of receiving Phil Klass's request for assistance, the author compiled his preliminary findings regarding both the superficial and internal effects of excessive ionizing radiation, though no two people or exposures are the same, and there is some expert opinion that differs on this. His sources indicated that temporary epilation or hair loss requires, for a single exposure, about 300 to 400 rad of ionizing radiation. It takes 2 to 3 weeks for onset, and following a resting stage, hair begins to regrow in 1 to 3 months, gray or white in color, but typically the same texture. Regarding the skin, acute onset of erythema, redness requires about 450 rad and should disappear within about 3 days. It will take exposure of greater than 1,000 to cause blistering and non-healing of sores. As for GI effects, while nausea and vomiting may be seen as at far lower doses, diarrhea lasting more than a few days would require exposure of 1,000 rad. So this kind of sets up the problems with this story, is that for them to have gotten the symptoms that they had so quickly, it would have required a radiation exposure that would have killed them invariably. And this is knowledge that's gleaned from the US Department of Energy and other bodies, and also research from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims, right? So in preparation for the chapter, the author reviewed some additional resources to augment his originals from 4 decades ago. A December 2017 US Department of Energy publication contains a graphic. I think it's this one down here. Yeah, it's showing like the exposures and the symptoms that you would get. And it's using REM there, by the way, REM, which is also a measure of radiation. But yeah, it's showing the symptoms there and what you would get if you're exposed to those things typically.
Yeah, not to be confused with rapid eye movement.
Yeah, right.
For practical purposes, a rad is a REM, which is 1,000 millirem. So, yeah.
So its timeline number 5 confirms temporary epilation to typically have a 3-week onset following a dosage of about 260 to 300 rem. Early 2 to 24-hour onset transient skin erythema, sorry, I was mispronouncing that, can occur from as little as 190 rem, while main erythema reactions require about 530, roughly the same minimal requirements for circulating blood cell death and moderate GI damage, with death probable 2 to 3 weeks. Without medical intervention, the LD 50/30, which is the dose likely to be fatal to 50% of victims within 30 days, is roughly 340 to 500 rem. And on the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention webpage devoted to acute radiation syndrome, there's a table implying that exposure in the 50 rad range should manifest in mild blood-related findings, and that a dose in the 600 rad range is necessary for any notable GI effects. Diarrhea continuing for more than a few days, if resulting from an acute exposure, would be severe and indicative of a full-blown GI syndrome needing 1,000 or more rad, with death within 2 weeks. The US Atomic Energy Commission concurs that this level of whole body irradiation leaves the prospect of recovery so poor that therapy may be restricted to palliative measures, followed almost invariably by death within 2 weeks. Right, so that's these things have been pretty well worked out by decades of observation. Again, from the beginning of the nuclear age and subsequently.
Seems more likely to me that they got food poisoning or something, and that's what caused the GI issues for all of them for a couple of days.
Yeah.
Something I was considering too is that it seemed like her symptoms were pretty consistent with maybe heat stroke, which probably wouldn't make sense for the time. The symptoms associated with her eyes, especially, let's see, well, we'll get to it, but the symptoms associated with the eyes seemed mostly to be most consistent with something called photic retinopathy, which is what you get if you, for example, stare at an eclipse or something like that, or your eyes are exposed to too much UV radiation all at once, kind of thing. And because that can last for a month to a year, and it can include sort of, I don't remember what they're called, but these sort of weird things over the eyes that look kind of like cataracts, which is what she talks about. The swollen eyes, I don't think are, again, not a medical expert, but the swollen eyes, I don't think are a symptom of photic retinopathy, but they could be, maybe have to do with, you know, the other symptoms, the alopecia and things like that. So yeah. I was kind of playing with the idea that maybe she was dehydrated and somehow had heat stroke or something like that, and then this led to shock and stress, which then led to the alopecia, and perhaps flaky skin from the scalp could have caused her eyes to become swollen.
Yeah.
Just speculation, but it was something I was thinking about. They also talk about a bright light, so I'm kind of trying to support the testimony of the witnesses, which I see why their testimony is doubted a lot, especially Vicky's. But I'm kind of wondering, is it possible that they did have some sort of strange experience? Maybe not exactly what they reported, but. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also pretty inclined to believe them that they did see something or they experienced something unpleasant, even if they consciously embellished stuff for financial gain or compensation. Doesn't mean that they were lying.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean it was ionizing radiation either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it was ionized.
I don't think
I think that's a pretty
effects.
Outlandish conclusion.
Yeah, I don't think their medical effects have anything to do with the incident, like really whatsoever. But I still think they probably saw something. But yeah, I think they're just two separate issues.
Mm-hmm. So the principal investigation of this case was conducted by MUFON. The December 1982 issue of its journal contains an article by Paul Stowe, MUFON's research specialist in nuclear tech. He talks more about his views there. And following his article, Peter Rank, MD, a practicing radiologist in Madison, Wisconsin, and MUFON consultant, writes, he would agree totally with Stowe's analysis, yet he parts with Stowe regarding both the assumption of deep total body exposure, which was to him by no means clear, and the estimated 200 to 300 rem. I do not believe that a general dosage level can be assigned. Rank does concur that both women had symptoms of radiation sickness, though he notes that there were no well-documented changes in the blood, which is significant. And I think we'll come back to the blood later on. Vicky, so within the next paragraph there, Vicky took Betty to the hospital where she was admitted as a burn patient. And Betty was like, she went to hospital many times after this incident. And sometimes she was treated for different things, like hair loss and so on, skin conditions. So she took her to the hospital, and where she was admitted as a burn patient, and over the next several days lost patches of skin on her face, and about 50% of her hair fell out. And there's a photo. And then you made a point, didn't you, Rachel, about the location of the hair loss?
Yes, I did. And also, sorry, I think I'm confusing Vicky and Betty here. I'm not an expert on this case, although, I'm of course familiar with it. But yeah, something that I noticed, which is probably not actually that important, is that the hair loss, they talked about how it was in the temporoparietal region on both sides of the head. And as I talked about in an episode of the UFO Detox Hour, the temporoparietal junction of the brain is also associated with certain types of anomalous experiences. But, but this area is also really common in alopecia, I guess, and it probably has nothing at all to do with brain activity and probably has something to do with stress or an immunodeficiency.
Yep.
It's also important to note that hair loss happened much later. Like when she first presented, the doctor said he didn't notice any hair loss.
Yeah, and that detail about her pulling clumps out of hair or whatever that night was certainly embellished.
He says only after a month later did they notice areas of alopecia, but noticed like nothing the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tim had a question. What are your thoughts about the allegation that the burn mark was actually from a hair dryer?
Well, there is discussion, a little bit of discussion here about
Yeah.
a UV lamp that maybe Vicky used, right? And
But she would have to like have like holes in the
some object to make patterns. Well, I mean, I don't know if that was proven, but that's possible.
I'm not sure you even need it though for the skin conditions and other issues that like she had, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And also, MUFON co-founder John Schuessler is mentioned in this paragraph. Has researched and written extensively about the case. He wrote an article in the July 1982 MUFON Symposium Proceedings, and states that Betty was directly exposed to the UFO for 5 to 10 minutes, Vicky 3 to 5, and he'd be a major advocate for this story and the idea that ionizing radiation was responsible. And gave some sort of evasive answers to the requests of the author of this article as well. Schuessler in 1998 published the Cash-Landrum UFO Incident, a book which, though largely anecdotal, contains passages that faithfully portray Betty's hospital records. According to his presentation, which in a couple of spots leaves him, the author, a bit hazy as to whether a date unspecified event took place during her first hospitalization or her second. Betty was initially admitted as a burn patient to Parkway Hospital on January 2nd, 1981, 4 days after the incident, with initial complaints of swellings of the eyes, scalp, and face, along with a terrible headache. She was later discharged. The consulting dermatologist, Dr. Solomon Brickman, noted areas of swelling and crusting of the scalp, face, and eyelids, which he diagnosed as cellulitis and treated with antibiotics and steroids. He made no mention of alopecia, nor did admitting physician Dr. V.B. Shenoy, who, per Schuessler, specifically noted that Betty had little, if any, hair loss upon admission. Scans were done of the head, which were negative, as were sinus x-rays, and neurologist Dr. K. Kumar concluded that her head pain was mostly probably due to a severe tension headache. I don't know what else to add here. I mean, it's kind of tedious. I don't want to read the whole thing, but it sort of goes on in this vein. And so, basically the upshot is that, especially with the blood results, that some of the symptoms, like if they were caused by ionizing radiation so quickly, then it would have been necessary for them also to have gotten the blood effect in the blood, but they weren't detected. And so that doesn't make any sense. And they would also have died, right? So, and also, yeah.
I was just going to point out some of the doctors kind of also seem to take her oral testimony that she was exposed to radiation as like the granted truth of what actually happened, and like base their opinions on that. Like when she went and saw the doctor for what was it, like COPD or whatever, the dermatologist said, given the patient's oral history of radiation exposure, they did biopsies of the skin and all these other things, but then determined it was just like hyperkeratic epithelial hyperplasia, basically thickened skin or like a callus or whatnot. So like these doctors seem to repeatedly take her own self-reported testimony that she was exposed to radiation as valid, yet like finding nothing to support that. And each of these repeated hospital visits, it does seem a little weird to me how long they kept her for some of these visits, but like I think that first visit she was there for like almost 2 weeks or something. And it's like, that seems like a long time, like, but for when they said she had a headache and, like some skin issues, but, it's hard to say because the thing is, like, they both had pre-existing health issues. They were older women that, had health issues before this. So it's not like these people were in like prime healthy condition and then they all of a sudden developed all this stuff out of the blue, like after this incident happened.
Yeah, and that was also like the breast cancer. I think that was that Betty's or Vicky's.
Betty's.
Yeah, and there was some intimations that she may already have had, feeling, or she might have checked herself and suspected that she had breast cancer before the entire incident, and may even have been examined. One of the doctors at least like sort of gave a vague answer to that to the investigator.
Yeah, Phil Class had asked Schuessler about it. It's like, what about this, that she may have had cancer before the incident happened?
Yeah.
Ultimately, he talked to lawyer Peter Gersten from POS, and this guy is a bit of a wackadoo who thought he was a wizard. Anyways, crazy guy. But he was a lawyer, and he kind of, I guess, sort of let it, I guess you could say, maybe slip. He's like, well, where'd you hear that from? And I guess Class recorded all his phone conversations he had with people and recorded this and kind of implied there might be some truth to it, but without kind of confirming. And I believe he said it wasn't diagnosed. If it was, it wasn't diagnosed. So she may have had some inkling, but not an official cancer diagnosis at that point. Which he then later got, and had already started chemotherapy and all this other stuff at that point. Yeah.
Yes. And well, that's like a sort of general problem in these. This would be like a second CE2, wouldn't it? Because it's like leaving physical traces. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
P.
it's a general problem, not just in cases where there's a supposed physiological effects from the UFO, but environmental effects, because you have to check, like, would that have happened anyway? And obviously you have to do all the radiation testing properly, like calibrate the instruments and so on. So it's sort of, this is like a microcosm of like, the dangers of maybe, not thinking clearly about what would have happened anyway, especially given that these women were, already starting to get, well, they weren't super old, but at the age where they would start probably having a higher incidence of these physiological symptoms.
And it's important to also note that those symptoms can be caused by all sorts of things. Like, radiation does cause those effects, but so do like thousands of other medical issues. And I'll say personally, like, I personally experienced almost all the symptoms they talk about in this paper. Like about 10 years ago, I would when I was in a period of high stress, I was having a lot of skin issues where I had like scaly skin on my scalp, like hair would sometimes come out of my head. Like, I had a lot of the exact same symptoms, like, chronic nausea and stomach and GI. Like, there's so many things that can cause these symptoms that are not radiation poison. I feel like a lot of these doctors kind of like were working backwards. Like, they decided that it was like radiation poisoning. The symptoms are similar to what you get with radiation poisoning, so it must be radiation poisoning, despite all evidence to the contrary, like the lack of any blood work that showed any deep level of radiation poisoning.
Yep. Amy Collins makes a good point there.
Yep. Yeah, it's this kind of a similar, I'll point out, thing has happened even more recently. So with this case, the whole thing is, if these symptoms were really caused, the crux of this paper is that these symptoms were truly caused by radiation, they would have died. They would not have lived, for decades more, they would not have had these symptoms over, several year period. And that's absolutely true. More recently, in fact, the reason I actually, when I first got on Twitter and on UFO Twitter, was because of the alleged radiation incident on Skinwalker Ranch in I believe it's like the very first episode. And they show the radiation meter, and you can see like the millirems and all that on it. And they imply, that he had to go to the hospital because he got exposed by radiation. And look, dangerous radiation. But if you look at the actual like numbers on the meter in the show and compare it, to like charts like shown in this paper, they were totally safe, normal background levels of radiation. Again, the symptoms they said, they compared them. These are the symptoms you get from radiation exposure. But just like in this case, if that was true, then those guys would be dead. They wouldn't still be doing the TV show a few seasons later. If they had truly been exposed to radiation that caused the symptoms they claimed, they would be dead now.
Yeah.
But it makes for a good sensational story. Like they got exposed to radiation by some UFO or paranormal event, and there's real physiological effects. They're really sick from something. They had some sort of effect. Like it tells a good story, and to people, like, that's good hard evidence. Like that's the real deal. We got people actually physiologically affected by the UFOs. But in every case I've looked into, there's no reason to tie any of the people's symptoms back to a UFO incident. The same is true for the Rendlesham case, which this case may have influenced that the act and the laws and legislation going through as far as like physiological effects. But I think the other big case is the Rendlesham event, where you've got Burroughs claiming he was permanently injured and on disability because of the UFO, which quite frankly is complete utter nonsense. It's like complete garbage. That's nonsense. But again, like there's a lot of people that want to tie their health effects to the UFO encounter when there's really just no causal link to the two. Like, and there's no reason to connect the two things.
Well, I mean, Vicky and Betty, they wouldn't have known that. I don't think they were experts.
Yeah.
So, it's easy for a layperson to, if they experience something anomalous or weird, and they then get effects, they're going to draw the causal connection.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And Colby, he's still alive, so he didn't die.
Yep.
Has he ever spoken about this, like in his adulthood?
Mm-hmm. I think he's been on. I want to say he's been on Podcast CFO with Martin Willis in the past. But I think he's done a few podcasts or shows like in the last 10 years or something, I want to say. I know I've seen him as an adult talk about it, but I don't think he talks about it much. But I believe he has. I'll have to do some searching on that one.
Yeah.
Something else I want to point out before we move on is that this case has been really, really studied extensively by a lot of different people, and there's a lot of material online about this case. Kurt Collins studied it heavily, and
his website's the go-to on this case. Like
blueblurrylines.com. Yeah, and the author here, I don't remember his name.
Posner.
Posner. Yeah. He also kind of shared information with Collins, or they shared information with each other and stuff like that. Again, Alan Hendry investigated this in depth, and a lot of people over the decades.
Yep.
And also, I should point out that Curtis, sorry, the heat is just killing me in here. Kurt Collins, he has come up with a sort of hypothesis for what it could have been actually, which here he doesn't really talk about that. This author doesn't really lay out what he thinks could have caused the sighting, but Kurt Collins does volunteer a possible explanation, which he ties to the Iran hostages crisis. So I think he, said that it might have been like some sort of parachute or paraglider contraption that they were testing, and that it was like thrown out of a cargo plane or something like that. I forget, I'd have to read it again, but it's something along those lines. But it would have been like a sort of rescue mission type apparatus. But anyway, I mean, it's anyone's guess what it could have been. And I don't know, what do you guys think it was?
I mean, I will point out that they do talk about a bit of the discrepancies between like the descriptions and what people actually really saw, right? So like on my post that I've done for the case, I've used like that painting on the right, which was done by John Schuessler's wife, I believe. And you get those portholes and stuff. And in fact, in the abstract of the paper, they mentioned the portholes, and apparently nobody actually saw portholes like on the object, right? Like as far as did they even see the diamond shape, the classic diamond shape? And it really turns out the only person that ever described it as a diamond was 7-year-old Kobe, who was inside the car and could barely see the thing the entire time. the rest of them really couldn't tell what the shape or figure was. It was like a bright light with things, sparks kicking off and stuff. Like, so a lot of like the famous descriptions and the kind of recreations and illustrations we get in TV shows and stuff, like a diamond shaped with like you know, it's really unclear that anyone actually saw a diamond besides Kobe, who described it as like a big diamond.
Yeah.
But he also said he couldn't tell. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm definitely not an expert on this case, but I know that there is a theory. I think it was proposed by what's his face, Bartholomew. Sorry, I'm not remembering his name.
Bartholomew.
Robert Bartholomew. Thank you. That some of these cases, specifically the one in Australia with the UFO landing on the car.
The Knowles case?
Yeah, and the Hopkinsville Goblins case, that sometimes what happens is you'll have like a group of people who are maybe exhausted, and for whatever reason they're under a high deal of stress, and so they can misinterpret normal stimuli, like say lights on the horizon or owls, and exaggerate those into more fantastical things. And I think, something maybe like that. I mean, I'm not sure if I necessarily buy that theory, but it might be possible that they were experiencing a lot of stress. Maybe one of them in particular was experiencing some sort of medical, health symptoms at the time, and then that led that one person to becoming really panicky, and then that spread to the other two witnesses, and that could have been exacerbated, and maybe they did see a really bright light, and and then over time their memories of the event got distorted, or perhaps even deliberately embellished too. But that's just speculation. I don't know enough about the case.
Yeah, I'll say one of the other kind of main things the article talks about that maybe we didn't exactly address was the aspect of like, was it a hoax for money making purposes or financial gain, and the lawsuits. So we did mention she did. So she thought the object was U.S. government craft. Like, she didn't think it was alien, and so the reason why she initially engaged Peter Gersten was they were filing a lawsuit, kind of basically to hold the government accountable for these, like the medical damages that they felt they got from what was a government operation, because they saw those helicopters that they said had U.S. Air Force markings on them and were convinced it was government. That was ultimately dismissed in 1986 because no government agency owned or operated any of those kind of twin rotor crafts fitting their description at that time in the area. They would later then go on to hire an entirely separate attorney in 1990, hoping to reopen the case, proving that the government had lied, but also hoping to sell their clients movie rights. So they were hoping to at least cash in a little bit and get a movie sold based on the experiences. Unfortunately, nothing came out of that second lawyer's efforts. The case wasn't reopened, and they didn't end up selling their movie rights. So I don't know how much. I mean, they probably still got some compensation in the form of the television shows and whatnot that they did over the years. But they didn't get that big money from the government they were hoping for, and they didn't get that big movie deal they were hoping for. As to my opinion as to whether they hoaxed it, again, I don't necessarily think they needed to hoax it per se. I think they probably had some real experience of, by all accounts, was an ambiguous light that they felt heat from. And from there, I think perhaps some details got wrong. You have to recall they went under hypnosis within like 6-7 months of the event happening. And it's a lot of this interviews and the details would also end up changing a bit over the years. One of the things Henry noted when he interviewed them was in all the previous storytellings, she had said that they basically turned the car off. They'd stopped and kind of turned the car off on their own. But when Henry was interviewing her, she told Henry that the car stopped because of like the UFO, like somebody turned it off for her, which is typical in the vehicle interference cases, like the Levelland case and a lot of these cases where people experience car stops. And so that aspect kind of changed. And I guess Schuessler was a little bit concerned about that. But Henry it looks like he almost kind of like wrote it off as just kind of a glitch in the retelling. But apparently she would reiterate that fact that later on during their interview with the Air Force Base, that, they didn't kill the motor, that something killed the motor for them as if it was shut off. And so her story, kind of did change and things, kind of were added. And I think you get that with absolutely any case that happens, is that over the years, all those different factors come into play and the narrative gets changed slightly and honed and restructured to fit into what people expect. And their memories get distorted. And there may not be a conscious effort in doing that. That's just, what they're doing. So, yeah. So I think they may have seen something. I don't think their medical effects had anything to do with what they saw per se. I mean, they may relate as far as like stress and things like that. But I don't think they were caused by the object.
And by the way, a lot of people don't know that Bob Lazar actually tried to draw sucker from this story as well in an early 90s interview with Michael Lindemann, who wrote a book with interviews with UFO people. Lazar claims that the craft was probably a plutonium-powered craft, which is like basically a copy of an alien vehicle, but instead of using element 115, it was plutonium.
Yeah,
which doesn't make sense because this case took place in 1980. Lazar rocks up in 1989, and he's supposedly the one who figures out what the element is. So wouldn't they have known that already, like almost a decade at least, right, before what the element was? Anyway, but
you expect consistency.
Yeah, and I think he said as well that the craft may be buried at the Nevada test site or at Area 51, which is a narrative that he basically copied that from John Lear, who claimed that there were UFOs or sources buried at Area 51. But anyway, that's just a little digression there.
Yeah. There was another story Henry had about a Army Guard unit pilot that had a helicopter sighting, but that apparently happened 2 years before, but apparently Vicky confused it and thought it was maybe the same event. It's also interesting to note that Vicky and Kobe attended just 4 months after this incident, a demonstration at like the base of twin rotor helicopters held not far from the Landrum home. So yeah, so there's lots of places they could have grabbed various elements from.
But overall, a pretty problematic case, and we'll never know really what happened. I don't think. So,
shall we move on?
Yep.
Yep.
The next one, the next paper is really enjoyable, actually, and it talks about the Weinstein catalog, which is a catalog by basically pilot reports of UFOs or of pilot reports of UFOs, and it's often held up as like this really high quality data set because these trained pilots who supposedly don't make mistakes or very rarely make mistakes when they're identifying things. It's got 1,300 plus cases, and so like that's often held up as like a really powerful piece of evidence. But there's a bunch of problems with it, so that's what the author here goes into. So here it says in the introduction, in my opinion, publishing UFO lists is a lazy way to make a case that UFOs require serious scientific study. It's similar to coin or stamp collecting, where the collector will try and impress the uninformed observer with a large collection of objects. However, if the collection contains a significant number of items that are worthless, what does it say for the entire collection? I have examined many cases in various catalogs being produced by UFO groups and organizations, and continue to be amazed at how a significant number of events on these lists are actually identifiable. Even worse is how these same faulty cases can be found in other collections. It appears that all of these various compilations reference each other and assumed that the incidents were properly vetted because they appear on somebody else's directory. So that's a fairly common problem among these databases in ufology. And then he talks about like the idea of the expert witness. So pilots are meant to be like the top of the cream of the crop, right? Because they fly their planes in the sky. They're trained to, be able to identify landmarks and other aircraft. And it's the opinion of Mr. Weinstein, Dominic Weinstein, that pilots are considered to be the most reliable of witnesses. And Weinstein says, training and experience make pilot and crews more reliable witnesses than others. They are used to unusual meteorological phenomena. They have the added advantage of being able to approach the phenomenon physically. Military pilots are trained to estimate distances, shapes, and speed of flying machines. So that's like the basis of that argument. And you hear it all the time, now with the Nimitz encounters and all that stuff to do with UAP spotted by military pilots and sensors, that the pilots can't possibly be wrong because they're the best pilots in the world, which is true, but like that doesn't mean that they can't make mistakes. And in this article, some examples of those mistakes are provided. The problem with this reasoning, he continues, the author now continues, is that while military pilots are trained to identify objects in the sky, they're only trained to deal with known aircraft. If they see another aircraft which they are familiar with, they can approximate details based on the angular size. But when we're talking about UFOs, that's an unknown. So nobody knows if it's 5 meters or 5 kilometers in size. So therefore, you cannot estimate other aspects of it, so altitude and speed, etc. And so it doesn't matter how well trained you are, if you can't accurately estimate the size, then all these other metrics are worthless. So pilots are highly trained, but how good are they at doing their primary job? It is somewhat surprising that the main cause of aircraft accidents is pilot error. Out of 1,516 accidents examined by the FAA between 1990 and 2002, 1,020, 68% can be attributed to aircraft or aircrew supervisory error. This does not mean pilots are always making mistakes, but it does demonstrate that they're not always dependable to perform the correct action when required. If they are not perfect performing their primary responsibility, how reliable can they be as observers when they're busy performing that task? Also, he goes into like World War II, where US and Japanese pilots who are fighting in the Pacific, they'd be sent out as like the eyes and ears of the fleet that they were serving, and they would often misidentify things like oil tankers and so on as aircraft carriers, and they'd call in airstrikes against them. But they'd be basically diverting resources, and sometimes it would like lead to a sort of comedy of errors. So that's what he mentions here. Some of these important battles in the Pacific actually kind of hinged on the outcomes of these mistakes. He continues, of course, this is not really comparing apples to apples. It's one thing to mistake the types of aircraft and ships or make a mistake in navigation in the heart of battle or in the heat of battle. It is another thing to see how pilots react to something they had never or rarely seen before. Perhaps the best way to evaluate how reliable pilots are in reporting UFOs is to see how they react to events involving known objects that were unknown to the pilots when they saw them. So things which are really kind of out of the ordinary, like meteorite reentries or satellite reentries. So he provides cases. Case study number 1 from November the 5th, 1990, a Russian rocket body re-entered the Earth's atmosphere over the North Sea, and that was tracked and they knew where it was coming down from. So astronomers knew that, but the pilots didn't know it at the time. So it was seen by many pilots, and their accounts indicated that they had what they had seen was something truly extraordinary. Some of the primary witnesses were Royal Air Force pilots, that's the British military air wing, flying Tornado aircraft over the North Sea, and commercial pilot Mike Dalton, who was piloting a 737 from Rome to London and located over the Alps. They describe it as a sort of even triangular shape with fainter lights in a formation, and they describe some movement and zooming and so on. And the other pilots do as well, so the military pilots. And some of them were very adamant that they'd seen something extraordinary. So one of them said, "This was definitely not a Russian satellite. I'm 100% certain of that. But, it was a Russian satellite. That's the point. This was a large aircraft, a quote unquote aircraft, and I could see detail of the lights and the engine area. I've never seen anything like it." So basically, something approximating a spaceship in the popular imagination is what he thinks he saw. It's interesting that these highly trained individuals felt that what they'd seen was not rocket debris re-entering the atmosphere, but some sort of piloted craft of large size that had incredible capabilities of speed and maneuverability. Even after over a decade, one of the Tornado pilots was still convinced he'd seen an exotic craft of some kind, even though all the evidence indicated otherwise. More important, this event involved multiple pilots making the same kind of error. So intense was their belief in what they think they saw, they could not be convinced that what they saw was something else. So that's a typical thing as well in many UFO cases, not just pilot reports. So also the important question, how many cases in the Weinstein catalog involve other pilots who saw the event listed, were able to identify the object for what it was, but did not make a report to the news media or government agency? And that gets to a sort of inherent bias in all UFO catalogs, is that the ones that make it into the catalog are, by definition, the ones that people think are UFOs. But there could be many cases where people correctly identify something, but they're not going to report that. So that doesn't get into a database. The second case is in Ghana in July 27, 1987. And the Ghana Times, a newspaper, described a UFO event seen over the southeastern region of the country. On the ground was a Ghana Air Force pilot who reported to US officials his observations of the UFO. The official who interviewed the pilot implied he was a very reliable witness. So well qualified. He's well known to the DAO. I guess that's the air wing or some military unit. And others as a serious professional, not given to flights of fancy or to any desire to attract attention to himself. He seems to have been embarrassed as well as mystified by this UFO sighting, and provided the details only reluctantly. Based on this description, one would expect his observations to be accurate. Additionally, he was on the ground and did not have to worry about flying the plane. So no distractions, right? So you would think that would add veracity to his account. So he describes some things that are actually fairly similar to the previous case, with like lights following a larger object, and some of the colors were sort of similar. And guess what? It was also a rocket re-entry, also from a Russian, the Cosmos 1870, re-entering. And the pilot described the craft he saw based on what he thought he saw. So he was sort of adding, or not adding details consciously, but he was trying to piece together what he thought he was seeing, and he probably drew on some popular motifs about UFOs. So his personal biases were likely affecting his interpretation of the event.
I found it interesting that his initial impression, though, was that it might have been just a falling meteorite, or
yeah,
and then it changed from there.
right.
Amy is talking about something really interesting in the chat right now, and I just wanted to make a note of it, if that's all right with you, Amy. Yeah, she's talking about a case that was brought to her by a flight controller at JPL from 1990, where allegedly a Ranger 3 spacecraft was shot by a UFO on the way to the moon in 1962.
Yeah.
But she was able to pretty quickly identify that it was bunk, though, I guess. He said that the spacecraft was shot shortly after gaining starlock on Canopus. As it turns out, Ranger 3 used a horizon sensor and not a star sensor. Then Amy says, I knew he was full of it.
Interesting.
Really interesting. All right, anyway, continue, Louise.
Next part here is about statistics and pilots. So one might consider these cases to be cherry picking or only looking at the low-hanging fruit. There are a great number of such cases in the UFO record involving meteors and space debris, but they're not the only source of pilot misreports. So the Blue Book files reveal pilots reporting meteors, satellites, but also space debris, planets, stars, and balloons, and other things as well as UFOs. They were not making up stories, but were just reporting what they had seen, something unusual that they could not identify. In some cases, it was nothing more than a light moving across the sky. In other cases, the object was described as a craft of some kind. Alan Hynek, examining the Blue Book files in the 70s, quantified the number of UFO reports made by pilots that could be explained as being 88% for the single pilots and 76% for multiple pilots. His remarks about the statistics. What we have here is a good example of a well-known psychological fact. Transference of skill and experience does not usually take place. That is, an expert in one field doesn't necessarily transfer his competence to another. Henry had a smaller and more limited database to work with. Most of his reports came from civilian air pilots. Still, his statistics came up with a value of 75% of mistaken identity. Not much different to what Hynek found. So all of this indicates that the belief that pilots are experts at observing and correctly evaluating unknown objects is a false premise. If pilots are mistaken 75 to 88% of the time when reporting UFOs, what does that say for a database that contains raw or improperly investigated reports? Can we draw the conclusion that roughly 80% of these cases are probably misidentifications? If pilots are wrong 4 out of 5 times, what does it say for the remaining 20% of UFO cases? So it doesn't augur well for those. Looking at the Weinstein catalog again, so it's often treated as an important reference to ufologists. The index appears to be quite extensive, but the author doubts that many UFO proponents have looked at it beyond the numbers. So his initial examination revealed that by his own count, 423 cases at no specific date or time, which by any reasonable standard defies the case's insufficient data. So when you don't have these crucial pieces of data, really you should throw out the case because you can't calibrate it against known events. So, you don't have a control or even a potential control, then you can't really compare it and say that this was really extraordinary or anomalous. So those cases should probably be thrown out. This means that before investigating a single case, almost a third of the cases in the Weinstein catalog should be rejected as containing inadequate information for analysis. After you remove those insufficient data cases, there are still 882 cases. When looking at these sightings, one quickly comes to the realization that a significant number use a single source of information. One case that he examined was in 1975 from California. The list gives us several sources, which makes one believe it must have been thoroughly investigated and used several independent sources. However, as one pulls on the string, the entire garment unravels. It appears that all of the individuals obtained their material from one single news story that was missing a lot of pertinent data. One cannot even tell which direction the object was seen from the available information. So again, missing data. And the most likely cause of the sighting was a Minuteman rocket launch, but we cannot verify it for sure because the date was inadequate. And here is some more cases in that table. To date, he's looked at 45 of those cases and has been able to find potential explanations for them. Additionally, Ted Molzen's database of visually sighted space debris reentries identifies 10 more as being space debris reentries. So many of the cases in the Weinstein catalog are undoubtedly or very, very likely to be IFOs. Mundane things like balloons, fireballs, and Venus, again, the queen of UFOs. Research balloons, Venus. What does Altair mean? Is that an airline?
The star, Altair.
Oh, Altair. Okay. Yeah, and Jupiter as well. Subsun, etc. So all of these things. Soviet ICBM test in one of those. And
Ted Molzen. Ted Molzen was with Moonwatch, and he later went on to he runs the Visual Satellite Observers homepage, and he administrates what's called the CSAT-L. He's probably one of the most famous citizen satellite watchers in the world. He's been interviewed by everyone from the New York Times, like tracking supposed mystery spy satellites and all sorts of stuff. So he was one of these people that came out of Moonwatch, wanted to continue the citizen efforts to kind of like monitor these satellites and stuff, and runs this really great website. In fact, he has a whole spreadsheet, a chart of satellite reentries that he even has a table for to tie them to UFO sightings. Like, this is a UFO sighting, is actually this satellite launch, that happened at this time. That is very worthwhile checking out.
Has he ever collaborated with James Oberg?
I'm pretty sure he has. I've seen Oberg reference Molzen's websites and work before. But yeah. So he's like the go-to guy for citizen satellite tracking, and he's been doing it for a very, very long time.
And this also reminds me, by the way, of some videos you can find on YouTube of people with their phones or cameras. They're filming a rocket separation event, a booster separation, and they've got no idea what they're watching. It looks like a sort of, flaring pattern. And if you don't know what you're seeing, you're going to think it's a UFO. But
yeah,
as we saw with previously in another episode with satellite reentries.
Yep. Yeah.
So a lot of these cases are, probably IFOs, and there's all the details there. And yeah, so notice that many of the sightings involve satellite reentries and rocket launches, which should have been checked before even putting them on the list. Other sources of these reports involved fireball meteors, satellites, planets and stars, balloons, and in one case, possibly the moon. These are all objects that pilots should be familiar with, but still misidentified. All of this data refutes Mr. Weinstein's claim that pilots are unlikely to make observational errors. He gives some suggestions about how to improve the catalog. So even though he's dismissive of the list, he does think it's improvable by eliminating all the cases that have got potential explanations or lack sufficient data for evaluation. Of course, this would probably reduce the record to maybe 100 or even fewer cases, but at least they'd be much better cases. And another culling, however, has to occur after that to eliminate cases where insufficient data is available for evaluation. While a date and time might be available, one also requires information like angular size, direction, and elevation to properly evaluate the event. So you shouldn't, this shotgun method that ufologists often use, and I've seen Leslie Kean as well talk about it in this book, UFOs, generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record. There's actually a mention of the Weinstein in there.
Yeah.
But so it's a serious problem, just using the massive sightings to sort of assuage the problems associated with particular sightings, right? So it's like a quantity is going to fix the lack of low quality, right? Is the fallacy that many ufologists are working with there. Or as Brian Dunning notes, you can stack cow pies as high as you want, but you won't turn them into a bar of gold.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah. Sorry, Rachel.
Okay.
But what if you have a particle accelerator in your basement?
Bob Lazar has probably done this, actually. I bet he's got like bars of gold from cow patties.
Probably.
So the author says that he doubts that his criticism will be accepted by many UFO proponents. Ufological lists are akin to propaganda pieces used to impress the uninformed. And how many times have UFO proponents mentioned Weinstein's catalog contains over 1,300 cases made by expert witnesses? They say this is a matter of fact without even looking or mentioning the flaws associated with the list. Ufology needs to set and meet higher standards than this if they want the respect of skeptics and science. They've got to demonstrate that they can tell the difference between garbage and gold. And there's actually, in that second reference, I think, is the link, right? Or at least it started in 2001. So Weinstein, is he the person who's in charge of NARCAP?
No, he's not in charge of NARCAP. Like NARCAP was started by like Richard Haynes and Ted Rowe. I think Ted Rowe mostly does NARCAP now, I believe, because Richard Haynes isn't around anymore. But yeah, that his catalog is the technical report 4 put up by NICAP. And there's actually a bunch of other catalogs he was involved with, I believe, called like AQFO, which is like the airplane something, aircraft something, UFO catalog. Yeah, so like it's not his first catalog, but yeah, they've been cataloging these pilot sightings for a while. But like they say, this is the problem with pretty much any catalog. You look at, for example, the Sparks catalog of Blue Book Unknowns, and the author of this paper, Tim Printy, again in his Sunlight. So Phil Klass used to have his Skeptic UFO newsletter. Tim Printy kind of started with his own name, Sunlight, which is what he puts out. And he regularly addresses so-called Blue Book Unknowns that he then goes and explains, with Venus, stars, satellite entries, etc. And you can knock a lot of those off the list as well. So a lot of these things on these lists could be removed because, like I said, they don't have, there's either insufficient data to really even go anywhere with them. And they're not really unknowns or unidentifieds, if that's the case, or they're outright misidentifications and can be identified. And I believe you've addressed the issues of statistical studies, on UFOs, I believe, like on your blog and stuff before. And that's kind of the problem with garbage in, garbage out. So if you're doing all these studies and things like hotspot studies, just using raw data from UFO sighting databases, stuff like the MUFON database or the NUFORC database, like, you're using really a bunch of garbage data of cases that likely have explanations that haven't even been looked at, for example, or otherwise. And you can't really come to any useful conclusions if you're basing your information on a bunch of bad, unfiltered data. And unfortunately, that's the case with a lot of this UFO data. But people do point to the volume. And when I was a younger UFO guy, I did as well. Like people would ask me like what really has you think that there's something worth studying here? And I would say, well, it's the volume. It's like there's just so many cases. There's got to be something. There's got to be something there, because you got like hundreds of thousands of people that have seen and filed UFO reports. So, but again, it's deceptive because volume of garbage is still garbage. Like the amount of, you really got to stick to better cases. And unfortunately, most cases just don't have anything to go on and should be dismissed. As an archivist, I feel kind of weird about it because I want to record and keep everything. But at the same point, you should at least split your list. You should have like insufficient, unverifiable, like low quality case list. And you should keep your list like this catalog to stuff that has gone through a better filtering process where you've eliminated the IFOs, you've eliminated the insufficient data cases. Because like they say, if you've got a case where you don't even know what day it happened on, what are you going to do with that? You can't do anything with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of these UFO reports, I think that there's a good chunk of UFO reports that are interesting, but not because they were caused by actual phenomena in the sky. They're more interesting from an anthropological perspective. And like if there are actual stimuli causing, like scientifically unexplained preternatural stimuli causing some of these reports, then it's going to be just a little itsy bitsy tiny percentage, and you'd really have to get the garbage out. The noise vastly outweighs the signal.
I think one of the other main issues with these pilot sightings is the implication that they really try and sell it like as an aviation threat. Like these pilots are, these UAPs are a threat to the pilots up there, when that's a bad perspective. Like in every case where like a plane has potentially injured someone like this, there's cases throughout history, even just recently and going back to the 50s, where pilots basically injured passengers dodging what they thought was going to be a close impact to their plane, and what they were dodging was like Venus, or they were dodging a fireball in the upper atmosphere 100 miles away or whatever. So it's the pilot's misperception that is the aviation safety issue, not an actual object causing harm to a plane. It's how a pilot handles it. And so I think we need better training for pilots to how they handle these kind of unexplained incidents, is to not overreact or to like, kind of reduce their biases that they're putting into their perceptions. So I don't think UAPs are a threat to planes. I don't think there's any evidence that's ever been the case. I think pilots thinking they see UAPs is a threat to planes. I think it's a psychological issue, not an actual physical issue. And I frankly don't see the point of these organizations like Ryan Graves starts up, like the Safe Aerospace or whatever organization. Like, I don't see the point of that personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is possible that something like a booster reentry or an asteroid entering the atmosphere could pose a danger to a plane, but the odds of that happening are just extremely low.
Yeah, it's usually way further away than they think it is, and they're just perceiving distances. And because that's like we said at the very beginning, like unless you have reference points, like it's an unknown. Like you don't know the size of it, you don't know its distance, like you don't know its speed, like it's an unknown. And so it doesn't matter how good of an observer you are, you don't know that information, and you can't figure out that information without references.
And by the way, this made me think about something that I saw in Brian Dunning's movie, the movie that they don't want you to see.
Yeah,
you know what I mean about UFOs. Yeah, he mentions that it's fine to have astronomers as part of a UAP or UFO task force or ARROW, whatever, like body investigating UFOs, but we also need to have air crash investigators because they're experts at what pilots misidentify, like things on the ground that causes them to, get confused and lose control of the plane and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that they would be a very useful addition.
And the thing that I find so crazy is like I say, so many people on Twitter and the UFO community get so mad. It's like if you dare question a pilot's testimony, that there could be something inaccurate or unreliable about it. But like the thing is, like the Navy, for example, and the Air Force, they recognize that themselves. I've watched presentations by like Lieutenant Commander Navy fighter pilots on literally the kind of misperceptions and problems that specifically fighter pilots have when they're out there doing their thing. Because of like the various kind of high-speed maneuvers they do, they're subjected to all sorts of like spatiotemporal illusions and distortions that they experience. And they also are subject to things like confirmation bias. Like it's well known in the military, like when they get a radar target and then they vector a plane out to see if there's anything out there, many times they get false confirmations because a pilot's expecting to see something. And so then he looks for anything that he thinks might be that radar sighting when really it's not. Like he's gone out there with a preconceived like idea that he's supposed to be finding something, and then he finds something. And it's a well-known effect they have when they send pilots out to like, do confirmations of radar targets when they vector planes out there. So there's all sorts of issues that even fighter pilots recognize, the military recognizes, but for some reason the UFO community try to bring them up like, bad you, how dare you like question like a pilot. Because pilots, like you say, they're trained to do what they're trained to do. They're not trained to like analyze a UFO unexplained, like anomalous UFO situation. They're just not.
Mm-hmm.
And they're quite frankly not even trained to there's the problem is there's just stuff you can't train either. Like you can't train away like perceptual illusions and other things that are neurobiological and like have to do with like your brain. Like you can't train it away. You just can't. It doesn't matter how much training you have. Like there's some illusions, some kind of spatial temporal like distortions that they get that you can learn to recognize, but they say it requires a lot of training and that almost nobody gets it in the military. Like, so like, I think people are really confused about what they expect out of pilots. And honestly, I think it's unfair to pilots to put them up on this kind of pedestal and expect them to be perfect when they're just humans like the rest of us. And they're subject to the same kind of like perceptual illusions and distortions as the rest of us. In fact, they're subject to more because they're out there doing high speed maneuvers and high G turns and putting strains on their body that we're not putting on. And like they said, while at the same time having to fly that plane and do whatever it is they're supposed to be doing at the same time. And one of the biggest, I think, problems of a lot of pilot error is like inattentional awareness, like where people like they have too much going on and they get distracted and they forget to do something else on the plane. And that's what ends up causing like a pilot accident or an error to happen.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting to know during Moonwatch, I don't know if I mentioned this in the lecture, a guy called Herb Roth started something called the VFON, the Volunteer Flight Officer Network, where their whole job was to have pilots look for these satellites like the Sputnik and whatnot, like and other satellites in the air and report it because they figured pilots would be a good tool, like because they're up there flying around, high up there to see this stuff. And so there's a whole network that I'm not sure if it still exists today. It might still exist today, but that went on for many, many years, collecting reports from pilots. And a lot of pilot sightings we got actually come from like VFON reports that this guy Herb Roth started up.
Okay, I think that does it for the show tonight. Straighten your papers.
Straighten my papers, putting my clips on.
And for our final story, a tuning fork cloud drifted by outside my window. This morning at about 9:41 a.m., this reporter photographed a cloud sort of shaped like a squash tuning fork. or a sideways Y in northeast Portland. The photo was taken facing to the southeast on my balcony. The cloud was white and fluffy, hanging low in the sky, which means it was a cumulus cloud, and it drifted along the western edge of a group of other cumulus clouds stretching to the eastern horizon as they glided leisurely towards the southwest. The sun was shining and the weather pleasant with a light wind. Quote, "Ah, the bittersweet feeling of the fleeting nature of things," unquote, I was quoted as saying by me. While some of our viewers may find this story to be pretty trivial, I found the tuning fork cloud to be quite special and unique in its early autumn beauty. Besides, this story is about 1,000 times more significant than pretty much any so-called news story you will read ever that places any sort of stock in the UAP topic. Do yourselves a favor, friends. Don't listen to Disclose Bros. Instead, just go outside. Go and watch some clouds.
Go to Scientific American and read Louise's article with Vijay Balastromos. That's where you need to go.
True. Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or the other hosts. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at the Earth YouTube channel. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com, or your hair will spontaneously combust. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs and he doesn't make hardly any money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron, or visiting his Ko-Fi and buying him some coffee. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Swink. Excuse me. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Simon. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone there. Thank you to all of our viewers.
Thank you, our ghost viewers that are watching us from the afterlife.
Okay.
You watched that new Hulu show yet, Louise?
Which one?
Crimes of the Paranormal.
Nope.
Yeah, they addressed the John Ford case, the guy that tried to poison that Republican that politician with radium that used to run the Long Island UFO network. And they also addressed the Granger Taylor case of the guy in Vancouver, BC, that went missing, ostensibly on a UFO, but actually blew himself up with his pickup truck with a bunch of dynamite out in the forest. But yeah. Some interesting stories. That the theme is crimes that were related to UFO, not UFO specifically, but paranormal kind of related events. So there's some interesting stuff in there, some not so interesting stuff. But
I should check it out.
Real life X-Files sounds interesting.
I've been binging X-Files the last 3 days, so I'm going to put it back on again when this episode's done.
In the words of the disc, Mothman, forgive them, for they know not what they bro.